Welcome to your Branch Out podcast, where we explore communication, markets, digital behavior, and business signals shaping Southeast Asia. And, if you take a highly successful, high-converting marketing campaign that was designed in Singapore, and you just run those exact same ads 300 kilometers away in Kuala Lumpur, it won't just underperform. It will actively damage your brand.
Yeah, absolutely. It basically signals to the local market that you are, well, an outsider who just hasn't done the homework.
Right.
And that initial loss of trust, it's incredibly difficult to recover from.
It really is. And that reality is kind of the core thesis of our deep dive today. Because when businesses look at Southeast Asia, they tend to see a monolith, right? They look at the overarching data, like the fact that over 61.5% of the population holds a social media identity, and they just assume it operates under this shared digital logic.
Right, the classic ASEAN strategy assumption.
Exactly. The instinct is to look for a single, unified strategy. But for founders or regional operators and consultants listening right now, treating this region as a uniform digital market is arguably the most expensive assumption you can make.
Without a doubt. The region shares a deep mobile intensity, but it completely lacks a synchronized digital culture. The underlying architecture of how trust is formed, how authority is perceived, and how a transaction is finally agreed upon is, well, it's entirely fractured.
Yeah, completely different from border to border.
Exactly. A content format that captures massive attention in Manila will, frequently just be ignored in Ho Chi Minh City.
So to understand why that happens, I think we have to look at the first major signal from the latest data, because it completely breaks global baselines. Globally, the average internet user juggles somewhere around 6.8 social media platforms.
Right, about 6 or 7.
But Southeast Asia just shatters that. Users in the Philippines are juggling 8.36 platforms, Malaysians are at 8.12, and Indonesians are nearly at 8 as well.
And that high platform density, it creates a very specific trap for businesses and communication leads.
How so?
Well, when a regional director sees that an average user is on 8 different apps, the immediate corporate reflex is to just deploy this omnipresent, omnichannel strategy.
Like trying to be everywhere all at once.
Precisely. The assumption is that because the audience is everywhere, the brand must be everywhere too, broadcasting the exact same message to guarantee a touch point.
Which, on the surface, that feels like a safe, logical play. If an average user is checking 8 different apps, isn't the safest bet for a brand to just mirror their content across all of them to guarantee a touch point? It really feels like casting a wide net.
It does feel safe, but platform presence alone is no longer a strategy.
Wait, really? Even with that much fragmentation?
Yeah, because the fatal flaw in casting that wide net is ignoring that users actually compartmentalize their trust. The logic of the platform dictates their behavior.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so if a brand pushes a rigid corporate value proposition onto a platform where a user goes to experience like raw, unfiltered community entertainment, that brand isn't building credibility. They're just generating friction.
Right, they're annoying the user.
Exactly. The sequence of how a consumer moves from, granting you a few seconds of attention to actually trusting your expertise to eventually making a transaction, that shape changes entirely depending on the digital rhythm of that specific country.
Let's bring this down to the ground and look at how that rhythm dictates behavior in 2 major contrasting markets. Let's look at Singapore and Indonesia.
Oh, they serve as a brilliant study in opposites. They require entirely different philosophies of communication.
Right. So looking at the signals from Singapore, the internet penetration is staggering. It's well over 95%. But the data shows this really fascinating contradiction.
The drop in consumption time, right?
Exactly. Social media consumption time has actually dropped 8.4% year over year, down to just 2 hours and 2 minutes daily. Yeah, but at the exact same time, users are adding more platforms to their daily rotation. They're averaging 7.2 apps now, so they are spending less time but spreading it thinner.
And that tells us something really critical about the local business culture. Because Singaporean audiences demand ruthless efficiency.
They don't have time to waste.
Exactly. They are highly protective of their digital time. If we look at how professional credibility is built there, LinkedIn carries an unusually high weight.
And why is that?
It's driven by the dense concentration of regional headquarters, venture capital, and consulting firms. It is an ecosystem that relies on visible, verifiable authority.
Okay, but what about closing the deal? Because if LinkedIn is the public face of authority, where does the actual business happen?
Well, the professional trust almost always shifts to WhatsApp, which is used monthly by over 80% of the population.
2.1%, yeah.
Right. And what businesses often misunderstand about Singapore is the required tone.
Hmm.
Because time is so heavily guarded, communication must prioritize understatement, clear factual data, and immediate relevance.
Which means Indonesia operates on a completely different physical law of digital gravity.
Completely. In Indonesia, scale and velocity rule the platform economics. You are dealing with a massive, mobile-first population where a huge majority, over 80%, rely heavily on social media to conduct brand research.
So if Singapore is about curated precision, Indonesia is about sustained volume.
It is about creator intensity. TikTok and Instagram drive massive top-of-funnel discovery, especially for the younger urban demographics.
Hmm.
But frequency and authenticity consistently beat polish.
Interesting.
Yeah, if a brand over-indexes on highly produced, flawless corporate assets, they simply look like they don't belong. They get drowned out by a local creator who is just, publishing rough, highly engaging content 3 times a day.
So to put a visual to this, communicating in Singapore is like sliding a tightly curated executive summary across a boardroom table. It needs to be crisp and factual.
Yeah.
But Indonesia, on the other hand, operates more like a massive, vibrant night market. If you stand in the middle of that market, quietly polishing your laminated corporate brochure, you are going to lose the customer to the vendor next to you who is actively engaging the crowd, adapting on the fly, and speaking their language.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The practical consequence here is that regional operators must strip away their corporate polish when entering Jakarta. You need that rapid-fire, authentic energy just to be seen.
Right.
But, and this is key, you cannot export that Jakarta energy back to Singapore.
Mhm.
If you try to be overly casual or hyperactive in Singapore, you sacrifice your authority. The signals of trust are totally inverted.
So if velocity and engagement are the currencies in Indonesia, we really need to examine the content formats driving that speed across the rest of the region. Which brings us to the visual powerhouses, right? The Philippines and Vietnam.
Yeah, the shift toward video consumption in these markets isn't just a trend. It seems to be the primary mode of internet use.
The numbers are staggering. In the Philippines, internet users spend over 20 hours a week just watching online video. It holds its place as YouTube's top global market for penetration, 86.2%.
That is huge.
And alongside that, you have over 43.5% of the population actively following influencers. Then, in Vietnam, we see aggressive, sustained growth for TikTok, while YouTube also captures around 85% of the digital population.
But the behavior inside those video platforms is very different between the two countries.
How so?
It comes down to the cultural rhythm of how they interact with information. The Philippines has a highly expressive, deeply conversational digital culture. It is emotionally responsive.
Which explains Facebook's dominance there.
Exactly. Facebook remains structurally dominant because it serves as the underlying architecture of the internet there. It's where public discussion, brand interaction, and tight-knit family networks all converge.
Vietnam feels far more pragmatic, though, based on the sources.
It really is. It is a market that rewards rapid adaptation, particularly through visual learning. Audiences in Vietnam heavily prioritize educational video content. They want to be upskilled.
So selling directly isn't the best move.
Not at all. If you are a business trying to gain a foothold, companies that visually explain a concept or a tool or an industry insight consistently outperform companies that just push static promotional sales ads. Explainers build equity. Traditional ads are ignored.
I think a lot of B2B founders or consultants listening might struggle to see the application here, though. I mean, the prevailing wisdom is that short-form video and influencer culture is strictly for consumer brands, like fashion, cosmetics, food.
Sure, that's the stereotype.
Right. So if a company is selling enterprise software or supply chain logistics, how does an operator actually build professional credibility through a 60-second TikTok video? It feels like relying on a gimmick to sell a serious service.
It's a fair skepticism, but it relies on a Western assumption of how professional trust is initiated. In these specific markets, educational or entertaining video isn't a gimmick. It functions as the initial handshake.
Oh, so it's just the introduction.
Exactly, it is the trust bridge. Before a business in the Philippines will consider your B2B software, they need to feel a sense of conversational warmth and accessibility. If your brand is perceived as too rigid or faceless, you just aren't trusted.
And in Vietnam.
In Vietnam, that 60-second video isn't about closing a sale. It's about proving your competence by teaching the viewer something highly relevant to their daily operations.
Okay, so the video format breaks the ice and establishes familiarity. But you can't exactly negotiate a software contract in a YouTube comment section.
No, absolutely not. Which is why understanding the bottom of the funnel is so crucial. Once you capture attention through visual learning, the actual trust solidifies inside private communities.
Where are they going for that?
In Vietnam, that transition often moves into dedicated Facebook groups where professionals vet you. In the Philippines, the relationship moves into Messenger.
And that transition from public awareness to localized community spaces hinges entirely on language and cultural nuance. Because if a video feels slightly off-key, the user never makes that transition.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads us to the highly nuanced environments of Malaysia and Thailand.
Oh, these are the markets that truly dismantle the ASEAN strategy myth. They demand a forensic understanding of local signals.
Starting with Malaysia, the platform density there is the highest globally, hovering around 8.42 apps per user. Interestingly, it is also one of the biggest adopters of ChatGPT in the region, with nearly 40% adoption.
Which is fascinating.
It is, but the complexity really lies in how Malaysians navigate these spaces bilingually.
Malaysia operates on a strict bilingual logic that dictates professional versus community behavior. English language content dominates the professional ecosystems, specifically on platforms like LinkedIn and among urban demographics on Instagram. However, Malay language content is the engine for massive reach and deep cultural engagement on Facebook and TikTok. You have to know precisely which segment you are targeting, because using the wrong language on the wrong platform immediately alienates the audience.
And this ties directly back to our opening example about the Singaporean marketing campaign failing in Kuala Lumpur. The research noted that Malaysian audiences actively reject content that feels lazily adapted from Singapore. Why is that reaction so incredibly strong?
It comes down to tone and values. Singaporean corporate language often leans heavily into efficiency speak, words like optimize, leverage, scalable. It is highly transactional.
Right.
But Malaysian business culture, especially among SMEs, places a much higher premium on relationship-building language. Words like partnership, community, long-term growth.
So it's a completely different vibe.
Totally. When a Malaysian business owner reads a piece of content that was clearly written for a Singaporean audience, it sounds cold. It signals that the brand didn't care enough to tailor its approach. And so the perceived authenticity just drops to zero.
Thailand presents an entirely different challenge, though. It isn't just a matter of translating tone. It requires understanding a very specific, multi-layered digital funnel.
Yes. Thailand has over 50 million social identities, and the platform behavior is highly specialized. Facebook is treated as the public square. It is where you go to generate mass reach and spark public conversation.
And TikTok.
TikTok is leveraged to capture raw attention and entertain.
But professional trust is built elsewhere.
Yes, on LinkedIn. But you have to contextualize that. There are only about 6.6 million users on LinkedIn in Thailand, and they are heavily concentrated in the 25 to 34 age demographic within multinational or founder roles.
So it is a smaller pool, but they are the gatekeepers.
Precisely.
And once you've engaged those gatekeepers, the entire transaction moves into the dark.
It moves to the line. And this is perhaps the most critical blind spot for foreign operators expanding into Southeast Asia. They severely underestimate the hidden layer of private mess.
Let's spend some time on this because it feels like the central mechanism that ties everything we've discussed today together. I mean, we have WhatsApp dominating in Singapore, Malaysia, in Indonesia. We have Line running the economy in Thailand. And we have Messenger deeply entrenched in the Philippines and Vietnam.
The mechanism of trust here is rooted in how Asian business cultures navigate relationships. Public platforms, whether it's a high-velocity TikTok in Jakarta, an educational YouTube video in Ho Chi Minh City, or a polished LinkedIn post in Bangkok, they exist purely to create awareness and establish a baseline of credibility.
Right, getting your foot in the door.
Exactly. But public platforms are not where you negotiate. You don't ask nuanced questions about pricing or express doubts in a public comment thread. The actual trust building, the relationship continuity, and the final decision-making process occur almost entirely within private messaging apps.
If I synthesize that for a communication lead or founder listening right now, it completely shifts the goalposts. A lot of regional teams spend their entire budget asking which platform gives us the strongest visibility. But that's just a vanity metric.
It really is.
It's like going to a massive, chaotic networking event, say TikTok or Facebook, and trying to get a signed contract right there on the floor. It doesn't work. The real strategy is using the networking event to exchange phone numbers so you can have a private one-on-one coffee the next day.
That is exactly how the architecture functions. If a brand spends all of its resources optimizing its public-facing content, but has no infrastructure or strategy for managing one-on-one relationships on WhatsApp or Line, well, they have built a funnel with no bottom.
The leads just fall out.
Right. The consumer discovers you, verifies that you exist, and then when they are ready to actually ask a question, they have no localized private channel to reach you, and the conversion fails.
We have covered a vast amount of ground today, moving from the illusion of a borderless digital region down to the highly specific psychological realities of how trust operates country by country. As we bring this to a close, what is the strategic framework that our listeners should apply when they sit down to plan their next regional rollout?
I would challenge leaders to stop thinking about platforms purely in terms of reach and start categorizing them by their psychological function. Before you allocate a single dollar of ad spend, you need to answer 3 questions for the specific local market you are targeting.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, which platform carries trust? Because reach without cultural trust yields 0 conversions.
Makes sense. Second.
Second, which platform carries explanation? When a user in that specific country wants to understand your complex product, do they prefer reading a white paper on LinkedIn or watching a visual breakdown on YouTube?
Right. And the third.
Third, which platform carries relationship continuity?
And as we've seen throughout this deep dive, that third pillar is almost universally a private messaging app.
It is the localized compass you need. Regional sameness is a myth. You simply cannot navigate these fragmented markets without respecting the local trust mechanics first.
It does make you wonder about the future, though, especially as AI agents become capable of instantly translating and formatting content for all these different platforms simultaneously. Will businesses be able to essentially hack this cultural trust at scale, or will audiences become even more protective of authentic, human-led community spaces when they realize the content is synthesized? It is something every brand will have to reckon with very soon. That closes our discussion for today.
Thank you for listening to Branch Out by Y Consulting, where we examine the signals shaping business across Southeast Asia. Keep watching the signals. We'll speak with you again in the next episode.